My name is Sophia, and I've been married to my husband, Ethan, for almost 3 years. At first, our relationship felt like a dream, filled with love, laughter, and a sense of mutual respect. However, over time, I've started to feel a deep-seated exhaustion creeping in. It's a weariness that goes beyond the surface, touching every aspect of our marriage. I find myself questioning whether this is truly the life I envisioned when we exchanged our vows. Lately, I've been growing increasingly tired of the dynamics between us. It's not that I don't care about Ethan, it's more complex than that. There's a growing sense of disconnection, like we're drifting apart without even realizing it. The little things that once brought us joy now feel like burdens, and I'm left wondering if this is just a phase or if it's something more profound. This weekend, my mother is coming to visit, and the very thought of it fills me with a mix of dread and anxiety. My relationship with her has always been complicated, and her visits tend to bring out the worst in me. In an attempt to avoid unnecessary tension, I suggested to Ethan that he stay home while I go out for a bit, perhaps to clear my head or just to escape the inevitable confrontation. His response, however, was unexpected and unsettling. He looked at me with a mix of confusion and annoyance, asking, "Really? You're telling me to stay at home? But what about you, Sophia? Where are you going?" His words cut deeper than I anticipated. It wasn't just a simple question, it felt like an accusation, as if he was implying that I was being selfish or hiding something from him. Usually, we don't interfere with each other's plans. We've always had a sort of unspoken agreement to respect each other's space. But things always seem to change when my mother-in-law is involved. It's as if her presence shifts the entire dynamic of our relationship, bringing underlying tensions to the surface. Whenever my mother-in-law visits, it's as though a dark cloud descends over our home. She's never been particularly fond of me, and her visits are often accompanied by a barrage of questions that feel more like accusations. "No children yet?" she asks, with a tone that suggests she's already made up her mind about who's to blame. It's always the same, her thinly veiled disapproval, the way she scrutinizes every aspect of my life, and the constant reminders of my supposed shortcomings as a wife. To minimize contact with her, I tried to explain my concerns to Ethan. I hoped he would understand, maybe even take my side for once. But instead, he dismissed my worries without a second thought. "My mother never says anything unpleasant," he insisted, his tone casual and unconcerned. His words felt like a betrayal. How could he be so blind to what I was going through? How could he ignore my feelings so easily? It's incredibly painful to realize that the person you love doesn't believe you, especially when it comes to something so personal and hurtful. I've tried to explain to Ethan how his mother treats me when he's not around, how she makes me feel like I'm not good enough, like I'm failing in my role as a wife. But he refuses to see it, brushing off my concerns as if they're nothing more than petty complaints. The day of her visit arrived, and despite my silent hope that Ethan would reconsider, he left without a second thought. He didn't cancel his plans, didn't even offer to stay and support me. I was left alone to face my mother-in-law, dreading what was to come. As I heard the doorbell ring, a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. I hesitated, standing frozen at the door, wishing I could just turn back time or make myself invisible. But eventually, I forced myself to open it, plastering on a smile that I didn't feel. The moment she stepped inside, the questions began. "Can I expect to hear news of a grandchild soon?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down. "How are things at night? Are you doing well?" Her words were invasive, each one cutting deeper than the last. It felt as if she was dissecting my life, prying into the most intimate details with a casual cruelty that made my skin crawl. I cringed inwardly at her relentless intrusion into my privacy. Her constant questioning about children has become a source of overwhelming stress for me. It's like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. But she doesn't realize, or perhaps doesn't care, about the pressure she's putting on me. Instead, she blames me for our lack of children, her voice dripping with disdain as she says things like, "You're utterly unreliable. You must think properly about children. What a useless daughter-in-law." Her words sting, each one like a slap in the face. It never even crosses her mind that the reason for not having children might lie with Ethan. He's the one who ignores this truth, conveniently leaving me to deal with the fallout. He goes about his life as if nothing is wrong, while I'm left to endure his mother's harsh judgments and cruel insinuations. As I listen to her berate me, a painful realization begins to take root. I'm losing the desire to have children with Ethan. The thought of raising a child with him, knowing he might ignore the baby just as he ignores my feelings, fills me with dread. I imagine a future where I'm left to shoulder all the responsibilities of parenthood alone, with Ethan distancing himself from the challenges and leaving me to fend for myself. So, no matter how much my mother-in-law insists on holding a grandchild, it's impossible, because I no longer want children. The idea of bringing a child into this strained and unsupportive environment feels like a burden too heavy to bear. I can't imagine subjecting an innocent life to the same pain and isolation that I'm currently experiencing. Despite my ongoing efforts to keep things civil, she persisted in making me the target of her frustrations, blaming everything from my posture to the tone of my voice for the tension between us. It was as though nothing I did could ever be right in her eyes. After she finally stormed out, leaving me alone in the echo of her harsh words, I felt an overwhelming need to reach out to someone who might understand. I picked up the phone and called my father-in-law, a man who had always been a steady, if somewhat quiet, source of support for me. He had known my own father for years. They were close friends long before I became part of the family. As I recounted the incident to him, describing how she had spoken to me with such cruelty, I could hear the disappointment in his voice. He didn't try to excuse her behavior. Instead, he offered a sincere apology, acknowledging how wrong it was for her to treat me that way. It was a rare moment of validation for me, one that I clung to like a lifeline in the stormy seas of my marriage. My father-in-law had always been in my corner, which was more than I could say for my mother-in-law. From the moment I entered their family, she had treated me with a chilly indifference that bordered on contempt. I knew the roots of her behavior ran deep. Years ago, she had strayed from her marriage, had an affair that shattered whatever trust might have existed between her and her husband. Though they remained together for the sake of their children, the emotional damage was irreversible. The affair had left her bitter and insecure, and it seemed that she had chosen me as the outlet for her unresolved anger. Every cold look, every cutting remark, was a reflection of the deep cracks in her own life, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. Just as I thought life could not possibly feel more suffocating, tragedy struck with a force I could never have anticipated. My father, the man who had always been my rock, passed away suddenly. The loss was a crushing blow, leaving me reeling. And as if that weren't enough, just a month later, my father-in-law died too. The double loss left me drowning in grief, struggling to keep my head above water. But even in the midst of my mourning, Ethan and my mother-in-law refused to ease their relentless pressure on me. They seemed almost indifferent to my pain, as if my suffering was nothing more than an inconvenience to them. At my father's funeral, of all places, my mother-in-law took it upon herself to spread a vicious rumor among the mourners. She claimed that my father had left behind a massive debt, a burden that I would now have to shoulder. It was the first time I had heard of such a thing, and the shock of it left me numb. When Ethan confronted me later, armed with this misinformation, his eyes were filled not with sympathy or concern, but with a hard, cold anger that I had never seen before. Up until my father-in-law's death, he had been the only person in that household who ever stood up for me, who ever tried to see things from my perspective. But with him gone, there was no one left to temper Ethan and my mother-in-law's growing hostility. Their behavior toward me grew more aggressive, more accusatory, as if they had finally found the justification they needed to turn against me completely. One morning, they summoned me into the living room, their expressions grim and foreboding. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach as I sat down, bracing myself for whatever they were about to say. Ethan's voice was cold and accusatory as he spoke. "Your father left a debt when he died, didn't he?" His words hit me like a slap. I had only just learned from a lawyer that my father had indeed left behind a substantial debt, $2 million, to be exact, but I had no idea how Ethan could have known this. I hadn't told anyone yet, not because I was trying to hide it, but because I was still processing the information myself. "I wasn't trying to keep it a secret," I began, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. "I didn't say anything because I'm still trying to understand the situation myself." But before I could explain that the debt wasn't something I was personally liable for, as long as I renounced the inheritance, Ethan interrupted me. He and my mother-in-law exchanged a glance, then she slid a stack of papers across the table toward me. "Divorce papers." "I should have known," Ethan said, his tone dripping with contempt. "You're just like your father, a parasite who racks up debts and expects others to bail you out. I can't be married to someone like that. Let's get divorced." His words cut deeper than I could have imagined, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I had never imagined it would come to this, that he would throw away our marriage so easily, especially when he knew how much I had already lost. But as I sat there, staring at the divorce papers, I realized that perhaps this was for the best. Life in that house had become a daily battle for survival, a place where I was surrounded by people who saw me as the enemy. With both my father and father-in-law gone, there was no one left to fight for me. Maybe it was time to stop fighting and walk away. "Fine," I said at last, my voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside me. "Let's get divorced." I picked up the pen and signed the papers, each stroke of the pen feeling like a door closing behind me. Ethan and my mother-in-law couldn't hide their satisfaction. As soon as the papers were signed, they were already making plans to celebrate their newfound freedom with a lavish dinner. They practically danced out the door, leaving me alone in what had been my home, now just a shell of painful memories. I didn't waste any time. While they were out, I called a friend to help me pack up my belongings. I moved quickly, not wanting to linger in that toxic environment any longer than necessary. As I was carrying the last of my boxes to the door, I overheard them talking as they returned from their celebration. Their voices were full of glee, loud and triumphant. "Good riddance," I heard Ethan say. "It feels so refreshing, like a weight has been lifted off our shoulders." Ignoring the sting of their words, I walked out of that house without a single glance back. I was leaving behind a life filled with pain and betrayal, but I was also stepping into something new, something that might finally allow me to heal. After I left, I reported my divorce to my company and began the process of building a new life for myself, determined to move forward without the shadows of my past holding me back. After being single for some time, I was unexpectedly transferred to a subsidiary located in a distant city. Although it was just a subsidiary, I was given a significant role, and along with that came a substantial increase in my salary. At first, everything seemed to be going well, but then Ethan, my ex-husband, and my mother-in-law began reaching out to me, demanding that I return some money. Their messages were frantic, filled with accusations. "What's going on? Give me back my money right now." I was completely taken aback. Ethan's sudden contact, coupled with these unexpected demands for money, left me feeling panicked and confused. As I tried to make sense of the situation, a chilling realization dawned on me: it had to be about the inheritance. A few days earlier, I had been summoned to Ethan and my mother-in-law's home for the reading of my late father-in-law's will. Perplexed as to why I was even involved, I asked Ethan, "Why am I here?" He begrudgingly explained that the lawyer had specifically instructed him to invite me. Ethan appeared irritated, seemingly worried that his father's inheritance might somehow end up in the hands of his ex-wife, me. However, the situation took an unexpected turn. The lawyer announced, "All of your father's $8 million inheritance is to be given to the former wife." The room fell silent. Ethan and my mother-in-law were too shocked to speak. The meeting ended without any further discussion, and I left, still in disbelief. A few days later, Ethan contacted me again, this time sounding desperate. He couldn't accept the reality of the situation. "Give back the money," he demanded. "What money are you talking about?" "I don't owe you anything," I replied, genuinely confused. "You stole my inheritance," he insisted, his voice filled with frustration and anger. "Was that inheritance really yours?" I asked, realizing that Ethan had convinced himself that he was entitled to it as the son. According to him, his father had mentioned that he wouldn't leave the inheritance to his wife due to her affair, so both Ethan and his mother had expected that the money would naturally go to him. But the reality was different. The inheritance had been left to me. "Do something," Ethan continued, now sounding more desperate than ever. "I thought I had an inheritance, so I paid off the mortgage on the house in full. Now I'm out of money." Ethan's impulsive actions had clearly put him in a difficult position. I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony of it all. "It's rude to laugh at your husband," he snapped, trying to regain some control of the situation. "Husband? We're not married anymore, remember? We're divorced and living separate lives." My words seemed to hit him hard, and he fell silent. His attempts at scolding me no longer had any effect. At that moment, I decided to bring up something I had kept to myself until now. "By the way, isn't there still a payment due? Aren't you going to pay it?" "What payment? What are you talking about?" Ethan asked, clearly puzzled. "Don't you remember the nightclub expenses I covered for you? You still haven't paid me back for that, have you?" I reminded him of the time he had gone overboard at a nightclub, splurging on his favorite girl and racking up a debt of $10,000. It was a moment of irony. I couldn't help but laugh at how he had mocked my father's debt, yet found himself in a similar financial bind. Ethan had promised to pay me back after our divorce, but that promise was never fulfilled. After the divorce, as my life gradually stabilized, I had planned to consult a lawyer to recover that money. However, those plans had been temporarily put on hold due to the unexpected inheritance from my father-in-law. "If you're going to demand so much money from me, I can't just overlook the debt you owe me," I stated firmly. Ethan seemed completely baffled by this confrontation. He stammered, trying to come up with a response, but no words came out. Finally, he muttered, "No, please make the payment." $110,000? You're getting too cocky, aren't you?" Ethan's voice dripped with a mix of disbelief and arrogance as he brought up the money. His tone was a bitter cocktail of resentment and disbelief. The fact that I was inheriting $8 million seemed to gnaw at him, and he couldn't fathom the circumstances that led to this. "You're inheriting $8 million just because our fathers were close?" he sneered, his words loaded with envy. It was clear that Ethan was trying to deflect from the real issue, his mounting debt. Every time the conversation veered towards his financial troubles, he found a way to dodge it, but I wasn't going to allow him to escape this time. I took a deep breath, grounding myself before speaking. My tone was measured, calm, but firm. There was no room for misunderstanding. "Ethan, it's not as simple as you're making it out to be. I didn't just get handed $8 million for no reason. Do you remember when your father's company was on the brink of collapse? My father stepped in and took a huge risk to save it. He didn't do it lightly. He believed in your father and the company, and that's why he incurred a $2 million debt in the process. The company might have looked like it was doing well on the surface, but it was struggling deeply. My father tried to help, taking on that debt with the hope that he could silently pay it off over time. Unfortunately, he died before he could resolve it." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. I could see Ethan's expression change slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Your father knew exactly why that debt existed," I continued. "He understood the sacrifice my father made. That's why, when he decided to leave his estate, he chose to give it to me. He told me that the company's survival was thanks to my father's actions, and for that, he was deeply grateful." Ethan's face hardened, but there was a trace of confusion in his eyes. He was clearly struggling to reconcile the new information with what he thought he knew. I took another deep breath, preparing to reveal the full truth. "When your father told me he wanted to leave everything to me, I tried to refuse. I didn't feel right about it. It was a huge responsibility, and I knew it would create tension. But he was adamant. He said, 'If you don't want it, you can donate it, but whatever you do, don't give it to Ethan and his mother.' At that moment, I didn't fully understand his reasoning. But then he shared something that shocked me to my core." Ethan's eyes narrowed, as if bracing himself for what was coming. He looked at me, waiting, but I could tell he had no idea what I was about to say. "Ethan, do you really believe you had the right to receive that inheritance?" I asked, my voice steady, yet filled with the weight of the truth I was about to unveil. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice wavering. The bravado was gone, replaced by a growing sense of unease. "My father passed away and left me an $8 million inheritance. But there's something you need to know. You're not biologically related to your father." The shock that rippled across Ethan's face was almost palpable. His eyes widened, his mouth opening slightly as if to protest, but no words came out. He looked at me, searching for some sign that I was joking, but there was none. How do you know that?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "After your father discovered your mother's affair, he conducted a DNA test in secret to confirm your paternity," I explained. "He needed to know the truth. And the results confirmed his worst fears. You and your father are not biologically related. Your real father couldn't afford to raise you, and so your father stepped in and took you in as his own. He never told you this because, despite everything, he loved you as his own son. But there's more, Ethan. Your father recently found out something else, something that broke him even further." Ethan's face was now a mask of confusion and fear, his mind racing to keep up with the revelations. "Your father discovered that you and your mother were still seeing the man she had an affair with," I said, my voice steady but laced with the pain of knowing what this truth did to the man who had been so kind to me. "You were even dining out together behind his back. For years, you treated him like a wallet, something to be used, nothing more. That's why he made the decision to leave nothing to either of you." Ethan's face flushed with a mixture of surprise, embarrassment, and perhaps a touch of shame. He seemed to finally grasp why he wasn't receiving the inheritance he had so arrogantly assumed was his. "So, my father knew about all of that," he muttered, the realization sinking in with a painful finality. I looked at him, my emotions a mix of pity and frustration. Ethan had brought much of this upon himself, but it didn't make the situation any less tragic. "Yes, Ethan," I replied softly. "He knew. And that's why he made the decisions he did." There was a long pause as Ethan processed everything. The silence between us was thick with unspoken words, a heavy tension that hung in the air. Finally, he spoke, his voice tinged with desperation. "Sophia, can't we start over?" I didn't know. Maybe if we tried again, things could be different. But his plea fell on deaf ears. Any love I once had for Ethan had been eroded by the years of deceit, neglect, and his mother's cold, manipulative behavior. The thought of returning to that life was unbearable. "Ethan," I said, my voice firm and unyielding, "I have no intention of starting over with you. It's too late." With that, I ended the call, cutting off whatever he was going to say next. I needed to move on, to start fresh, and I couldn't do that with him lingering in my life. Days later, I heard that Ethan had shown up at my workplace, hoping to confront me or perhaps to plead his case in person. But I had anticipated this and had already informed my company about the situation. When he asked for me, they told him, "There's no employee by that name here." In truth, I had been transferred to a distant subsidiary, making it highly unlikely that Ethan would ever find me. From what I heard, he and his mother assumed I had quit my job because of the $8 million inheritance, but they were wrong. After consulting with a lawyer, the $110,000 was quickly paid back. I learned that Ethan had to borrow money to do so, as he had no savings left, likely due to his ongoing loan repayments. It was ironic, when my father passed away leaving debts, Ethan had abandoned me without a second thought. Now, it seemed that karma had come full circle. He was the one in debt, facing abandonment and isolation. If Ethan had someone who truly understood him, someone like my father, maybe things could have turned out differently for him. But with his character, it seemed unlikely that he would ever find that kind of support. Now, he was living with his overbearing mother, working tirelessly from morning until night to pay off his debts. Meanwhile, I was in a distant place, planning my future with the $8 million inheritance, living a life of peace and relaxation, far removed from the chaos that once surrounded me.